There is a recent groundbreaking book on the problem of evil, and it is completely free for you to download right now. The link is in the description below. What makes this book so groundbreaking? Well, typically the problem of evil is framed as an argument against the existence of God. But in this new book, Dr. Yujin Nagasawa turns the tables. He argues that the problem of evil is neutralized because it turns out to be just as big of a problem for atheists as it is for theists. In this video, we'll unpack his argument. Welcome. I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian. So, Dr. Nagasawa, early in the book, you say that the problem of evil is a version of the problem of axiological expectation mismatch. That's a mouthful. What is axiological expectation mismatch?
Yeah, so axiological expectation mismatch is my own terminology. It sounds a little bit technical, but the basic idea is very straightforward. So, if you are a theist, you have a certain theological expectation because you believe that an all-powerful, all-loving God created the world. So naturally, you would assume that the world is pretty good. It should be very good. But actually, when you look at the world, it doesn't look that great. You can find all kinds of horrible things like wars and crimes and natural disasters. So your observation doesn't match your expectation. And there is an axiological gap there. And that's the problem of axiological expectation mismatch. And I think this concept is very important to understand how deep the problem of evil is. Because people often think that the problem of evil is just a problem for theists specifically. So J.L. Mackie is a renowned atheist philosopher, and he published a book called The Miracle of Theism, but also his 1955 paper, Evil and Omnipotence. He introduced the logical problem of evil. And there he said that the problem of evil, at least the version that he's introducing there, is a specific problem for theists who believe that there is an all-powerful, all-loving God. So he says that if you're happy to give up God's omnipotence or moral perfection, then the problem of evil doesn't arise for you. But my claim is that the problem is much deeper than that. And the concept of axiological expectation mismatch helps to clarify my point.
In case some of my viewers might not be familiar with that term axiology, what is axiology?
Yeah, axiology is a claim about the value. So in this specific case, your axiological expectation is your expectation of how good or bad the world should be.
Okay.
So again, if you are a theist, your axiological expectation is high. You would assume that the world is very good.
Yes. Okay, that helps. So I do want to return to this by the end of the interview. I may go ahead and mention it now, and then if you say I'll address that later or let's save that, then we can do that, or you can address it now if you want.
Sure.
One thought is there have been some recent developments in the literature on the problem of evil that instead of focusing on axiology, focus on deontology. So I know that my friend Justin Mooney has published a paper, and I think Eric Wrighton has published some on this as well, the deontological problem of evil. And I wonder, the things you say in the book, obviously we're going to get to in the interview, but the sort of moves that you make, do you think those might be able to apply as well to a deontological expectation mismatch? We expect the world to be a certain way, not just in terms of goods and evils, but in terms of what's permissible and what's impermissible. And it doesn't match. It seems like it might not match that. Or I guess that's how I'm thinking of it.
Yeah, that's a good question. In my book, I focus on the axiological problem of evil because I don't think my argument applies to the deontological problem of evil. So I think this term was introduced by Michael Tooley. So he says that the deontological problem of evil is a problem for theists who believe that there is God as a moral agent. So God ought to eliminate evil in this world. It looks like if God is all-powerful and all-loving, then he's capable of eliminating evil, and he should be willing to eliminate evil. It seems that there is moral obligation for God to eliminate evil. But obviously, this doesn't apply to atheists, because atheists don't believe in the existence of any supernatural agent who can or cannot eliminate evil. That's why I want to focus on the other version of the problem of evil, which is the axiological problem of evil, which is the idea that the world should be axiologically, the world should reach a specific axiological level, but given the existence of evil, it doesn't meet that level. And that's the problem for, traditionally it's understood as a problem for theists, because again, theists believe that God is an all-powerful, all-loving being. So God should, it is expected axiologically that the world that the God create is very good.
Once you lay out the problem of axiological expectation mismatch, you spend the rest of the book looking at ways that evil is a problem for alternatives to theism, like pantheism and axiarchism and atheism. Since we're limited on time, I'm going to focus this interview just on the section of the book devoted to the problem of evil for atheists. And there's kind of two sections, actually. There's, I guess, Western atheist and Eastern atheist. We're not even going to touch the problem with respect to the Eastern atheists. I guess I'm focused more on the way atheism works here in the West. So we're really limiting the discussion here. So in that section of the book, you start out by talking about systemic evil, specifically the problem of systemic evil for theism. What is that?
Yeah, so my argument consists of several steps. And the first step is to establish the problem of systemic evil. It is initially a problem for theists. And it goes something like this. So if you look at nature, then our biological existence is dependent on evolution and natural selection, which is a biological system. And this system is very cruel. It necessitates pain and suffering for uncountably many sentient animals and humans. Sometimes I think this is nature is analogous to a situation where someone prepares a big cage where they put a lot of animals there and a limited amount of food and water and lock the cage and see which animals will survive. And this is a very cruel thing to do. But nature is a little bit like that, because the system of natural selection and evolution guarantees constant competitions for survival for animals and humans. And I think it's important to focus on the system here, because the traditional problem of evil, they focus on specific events, like the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide and these specific events, or at least specific types of events, like wars and crimes and natural disasters. But these are contingent events. And in many cases, humans are at least partly responsible. But the system of evolution and natural selection, humans are not responsible for the existence of the system. And I think this is a very strong challenge, significant challenge for theists, because theists would have to say that nature was created by God. So obviously God is responsible for the existence of this system. So how could an all-powerful, all-loving God create this very cruel, violent, competitive system? So that's the problem of systemic evil for theists, at least initially.
Okay, yeah, so that's the first step of the argument. The second step, you shift to optimism more generally, and then by the end, you're talking about modest optimism. So what do you have in mind when you're talking about optimism versus modest optimism?
Yeah, so I focus on optimism because I think that the problem of evil, or more specifically, the problem of systemic evil for theists arise because theists are generally optimists with respect to the axiological status of the world. So again, theists believe that an all-powerful, all-loving God created the world. So the axiological level of the world is very high. So they are axiological optimists. But the existence of this cruel system suggests that actually the world seems to be systematically and pretty fundamentally evil or filled with pain and suffering. So that's why I want to talk about optimism here. And when it comes to optimism, we don't necessarily need to presuppose theism, and that entails axiological optimism, but we don't need the concept of God to derive optimism. So atheists, as far as I know, I would say many or even most atheists, they are optimists. At least they are modest optimists who believe that the world is not overall or fundamentally bad. At least they are overall and fundamentally good, or at least neutral. And if they accept this kind of very minimum form of optimism, they also have to face the problem of systemic evil. So that's my second step, to apply the problem of systemic evil to atheism as well, or at least atheistic optimism.
Before we look specifically at some of the details about how this would apply to atheists, why do you think that a significant number of atheists, like you said, many, if not most, are modest optimists? Is that just purely anecdotal? Is there any kind of maybe research or something you can point to that would bear this out?
Yeah, so there are several reasons to think that many atheists are optimists. One reason is anecdotal. So if you look at what the atheists say about life and the world and those things, they are not like depressed pessimists. That's a caricature. People tend to say that atheists, they are very pessimistic, sad people. But I don't think that's true. I think many atheists, they express how lucky they are to be alive and how wonderful the world is. Even Richard Dawkins, who is a very powerful atheist, he says that the probability that we could have come into existence is very low, but we came into existence and we should be grateful that we are alive and appreciate the beauty of this world. So even he's not a pessimistic kind of atheist. The second reason is that there are a lot of psychological research, empirical studies on how optimism is prevalent. So people generally have optimist bias in relation to all kinds of negative events, including events that are related to the problem of evil. So people tend to be optimistic about natural disasters, crimes, even more specific things like traffic accidents and divorce and those things. When people encounter horrific events like natural disasters, initially they suppress their optimism, but normally after a few weeks or few months, they recover their optimism. And that's a consistent finding in psychology. So generally speaking, most people, including atheists, they are optimists. And a third reason is that there are, certain atheistic or non-theistic positions, they seem to entail optimism. So we don't have time to discuss axiarchism or pantheism, but I categorize them non-theism or some kind of atheism. And these views, they seem to entail optimism as well. And there are many axiarchists and pantheists as well. So these are the three reasons to think that many atheists are optimists rather than pessimists.
Okay.
Can I just add one more thing?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So if atheists say that, no, we don't have to accept optimism. It's perfectly consistent to be atheistic pessimists, then I'm fine. Then I would say, yeah, you're a pessimist. You think that the world is overall and fundamentally not good. So you don't need to face the problem of evil. So I think pessimism is a consistent philosophical position in light of the existence of systemic evil. But my guess is that there are very few atheists who would say that they're happy to accept that the world is overall and fundamentally bad. There are philosophical pessimists like David Benatar. So for instance, Benatar says that existence is a harm. It's never good to exist. Once we exist, we have to continue existing until we die, but it's better not to come into existence. And that's a clear statement of pessimism, but there are very few atheists like Benatar, as far as I know.
I guess on that point, what would the cost be to accepting pessimism? I mean, why wouldn't the atheist say, oh, yeah, it does look like I'm being inconsistent somehow, so yeah, I'll just be a pessimist? What's the real cost there, if any?
Yeah, so philosophically speaking, there is no cost there. If your ultimate goal is to have a coherent worldview, and if your inclination is to accept atheism, then yeah, pessimism is natural, and that wouldn't make your worldview contradictory. But it's quite difficult to maintain pessimism while trying to have a meaningful and flourishing life. William Lane Craig has an argument saying that in order for life to be meaningful, there has to be God and immortality. And if God doesn't exist, then there's no immortality, there's no ultimate purpose in life. And my argument is somewhat similar to that. So people want to accept optimism generally because we want to think that we live in a good world, and if we try hard, in principle at least, we can have a very good life. But once you accept pessimism, that kind of picture is gone, which many people find very difficult to accept.
So since you brought up the William Lane Craig view, and I know you're not saying that's exactly what you're saying. There are similarities and there are differences in what you're saying and what he's saying. But so I interviewed Timothy Mawson he critiqued Dr. Craig's that particular argument. And one sort of distinction, I'm wondering if an atheist can make this distinction and get out of the problem that you're laying out. And that is thinking both as humanity as a whole or the system as a whole, say, versus them as an individual. So maybe they can be optimistic about themselves or their life at that kind of individual level, or maybe, their community, the small community they find themselves in, they're optimistic with respect to that. But the system as a whole, they're pessimists with respect to that. It seems like they could go on functioning largely the way that they already do without much cost if they adopted that sort of view. But I could be wrong about that. Do you have pushback there?
Yeah, that can be a pragmatic solution to the problem. So atheists can say, okay, ontologically speaking, this world is pretty bad, systematically bad, possibly fundamentally bad. As individuals, we try to embrace optimism. That's a possibility, but then you would have to acknowledge that you might be a very privileged person who can have a great life in this horrible world. But you also have to acknowledge that your existence is dependent on pain and suffering of billions of animals and people as well, which is quite a bleak view, I think. So when Dawkins says that the world is beautiful and we should be grateful that we can appreciate it and we are lucky to be alive, I don't think he's saying I'm a professor at Oxford with a good job and a good salary and I'm a fortunate person in a wealthy country and so on. I would assume that he's making a bigger claim about the whole humanity. Of course, even theistic optimists have to acknowledge that there are some people who have to have unfortunate lives. But I would also think of these atheists. They are not saying that we are lucky, so we can have great lives. But nevertheless, the world is really bad.
And my good life depends on the awful system that's going on all around me. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, the focus on the system is quite important because here we are not talking about wars or natural disasters and other things. So it's not like you can somehow avoid it completely. It's not as if you are very unlucky, you will encounter these things. It's more like the system guarantees that billions of people and animals, they have to suffer.
Yes. Okay, so let's say somebody doesn't go the pessimism route that we've talked about, or whatever type of response I just gave, where you make a distinction between them as individuals or a small group versus humanity as a whole or something like that. Let's say they don't take those routes. And so you're left with what looks like this problem for atheism. Now, you spend a chapter in the book comparing what the theists can say in response to the problem and what the atheists can say in response to the problem. And you think that the theist actually has, and when I say theism, I'm talking about traditional theism, not a theism where God isn't all powerful or all good or something like that. You think that traditional theism has some advantages when responding to this problem of systemic evil that atheism doesn't. What are some of those advantages?
Right. So now the problem of evil. If the second step of my argument is successful, then the problem of systemic evil arises for both theists and atheists. So atheists can no longer say, this is not the problem for us. We don't need to worry about the problem of evil. So only theists, you guys have to worry about that. So they have to work with theists to address the problem of evil. And what is interesting here is that now theists seem to be significantly more advantaged, because theist ontology includes the material universe, and they also have a lot of supernatural entities in their ontology, while theists, they are typically naturalists. So they think that the spatial-temporal universe is all there is, and they, of course, don't believe in the existence of something beyond the universe, like God and immortality. So they don't have a lot of things to appeal to. So in this sense, theists are more advantaged than atheists. And now suppose that atheists can solve the problem of systemic evil by appealing to their resources within nature or within the spatial-temporal universe. Then theists, they can just borrow that response. So they can agree with atheists, saying that, okay, so you can resolve the problem of systemic evil by appealing to something within the naturalistic domain. And then, it's fine. Then the problem of evil doesn't arise for theists or atheists. That's fine. But suppose that there's no naturalistic solution to this problem. Then atheists are in trouble, but theists, they still have a lot of supernaturalist resources to appeal to. So they might be able to solve the problem of evil, even if naturalists or atheists cannot. So in this sense, theists are more advantaged than atheists. And I find it very interesting because people typically assume that the problem of evil is an argument against theism and for atheism. But now it's almost reversed. Once the problem of evil arises for both theists and atheists, theists are more advantaged than atheists, even though that doesn't necessarily mean that theists can definitely solve the problem.
Yeah, so I think even if somebody doesn't accept this step of the argument that theists somehow have an advantage, I think your major point is that it seems like the problem gets neutralized. At least it gets neutralized. And it might be that theists have a little bit, well, I don't know how much, you might say more than a little bit, but the theists have some advantage over atheists with respect to the problem of systemic evil. Does that sound right?
So when people read my book and they say, even if they don't agree with me about the final step, if they agree with me about the second step, where I say that the problem of evil, the problem of systemic evil arises for both theists and atheists, then I'm quite happy, because I think that's still an important finding, because again, it has been assumed for centuries that the problem of evil is a problem only for theists and not for atheists.
I understand the general move that you're making, where whatever resources the atheist has, theism also has those same resources plus more. And so if the atheists can solve it with their resources, then theists can solve it. And so then it looks like, well, the problem gets neutralized.
Right.
But if the atheists can't solve it with their resources, then since theism has some additional, maybe they can use those additional resources to solve it. So that's where they get the advantage. Right. I guess, what might those additional resources, well, maybe I want to ask too, like, what do you think's the best atheist solution to the problem with the resources they have? That's one question I am curious about. And then a second question is, those additional resources that theists have, what would those resources be that would help solve this problem?
Right. Okay. So, your response to the first question, I tried to think about what could be a naturalist response to the problem of systemic evil. One possibility is to say that, okay, evolution guarantees pain and suffering, but, other good things are realized through evolution. So pain and suffering are like first order evil, which could generate greater goods or something like that. So there can be the greater good theology by naturalists. That's one possibility. But I would think that it would be curious if naturalists would want to defend that kind of response, because naturalists tend to criticize theodicies, saying that the greater good theodicy doesn't solve the problem of evil. So if that's true, they cannot appeal to the naturalistic version of the greater good theodicy either. They could appeal to a naturalistic version of skeptical theism. So they might say, okay, the world seems to be systematically evil, but maybe overall, for some reason that we are not aware of, the world is overall good. And we can hope or believe that the world is overall good to maintain optimism. But again, naturalists tend to criticize theistic, skeptical theism as a solution to the problem. So I'm not sure if there can be any unique naturalistic response to the problem of evil, because after all, this is a version of the problem of evil. So any response that they can come up with might be quite similar to theists' response to the problem of evil. And regarding your second question, so what kind of theistic response would be successful in resolving this problem? Honest answer is that I don't know. I think the problem of evil is definitely the greatest challenge for theists, precisely because we don't have a response that is obviously successful. I think every response has certain problems, and I cannot see any definitive solution to the problem of evil. So I'm not saying that, I'm not even trying in my book to suggest a new solution to the problem of evil, because my main goal is to establish the problem of evil as a very powerful problem, not just for theists, but also for atheists.
Yes, yeah. I think with the second question, I wasn't so much asking what are those additional resources that you think succeed. I was just asking what might those additional resources even be. I mean, I know you're saying, well, we have supernatural agents, but it's the thought somebody watching might be like, so what? What good can these supernatural agents do? Is it that God can secure some sort of like universal salvation to where everyone gets compensated, or that's something that maybe, but I don't know, maybe the naturalists can cook up a scenario like that. So I'm just wondering, what might those additional resources even be? Even though you think they don't succeed, what might they even be?
Yeah, so universal salvation might be a good example. I don't think it's available for naturalists, because they would have to say that death is the end of our existence, because there's nothing beyond our material existence. But if you are a theist, there is God, which transcends the material universe, and this being might have some kind of salvific picture that is not available for naturalists. And also, the theists, they're supernaturalists, so they can appeal to our existence beyond death. They can talk about the afterlife and immortality and all kinds of things which are not available for naturalists. And I think that's a significant advantage. They almost have infinite resources that the naturalists
so obviously, I think a lot of atheists, so I'm thinking there's definitely a distinction between atheism and naturalism. If somebody has that distinction in mind, maybe they would want to say, yeah, I don't accept naturalism. Now, that may cut out a large swath of atheists at that point, because it seems, anecdotally here, that a large swath of atheists are naturalists. But somebody might say, I can have an afterlife even on atheism. Maybe I don't believe in any god or gods, but I can think that our existence continues or something like that. That might seem a little ad hoc. But I think, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. He is an atheist that either he's writing a book right now about this. He's an atheistic philosopher.
Is it
Do you know who
Eric
I'm talking about? I want to say his name is Eric Steinhardt, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Eric
So
is
I'm
my
thinking of
friend.
somebody like Eric Steinhardt. He may go for this route.
Yeah, Eric is a good friend of mine, and he defends a crazy view. That's a compliment. I like crazy view. So he defends a Platonic atheism. So he's a naturalist, but he thinks that naturalists have a lot of resources that they can appeal to defend something similar to religious ideas. And I mean, I think that might be an option if that kind of view is really tenable. then yeah, certainly you can avoid the problem of, you cannot avoid the problem of systemic evil, but at least you can appeal to something beyond natural. So that's an option. But as you say, if you just introduce this kind of unusual idea just to address this specific problem, then that would be an ad hoc response to the problem. And also, I don't mind that there are some unusual atheistic views that can avoid my problem, because I acknowledge that atheistic pessimists, they can avoid a problem. But I would say that they are minorities.
Yes, and I guess your major point still would stand, even like in the case of an Eric Steinhardt or something like that, or yeah, a view like that, because, well, okay, maybe theism doesn't have some advantage, but it can still, you just solved the problem, so then we can just the theist can just adopt your solution as well. And then it looks like the problem gets neutralized with respect to those two views.
Right.
And that to me is the most important point, maybe, of the biggest aim of your argument.
Yeah. So in a very rough picture, I think it's relatively easy to be an optimist and theist, and it's easy to be a pessimist and atheist. So these combinations are pretty straightforward. But if you want to be an atheist and optimist, that's quite difficult. And you might end up doing something unusual, like defending an atheistic form of supernaturalism or something like that. I don't necessarily say that those views are false, but they are quite difficult to defend, I think.
I hope my viewers will read the book and take it seriously, because you not only talk about atheism, like we mentioned, you also talk about other alternatives to theism, like pantheism and axiarchism, and even some Eastern religious sort of ideas, Eastern atheism too. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me. Did you have any final thoughts you want to give?
Yeah, I think people like to focus on my argument, the problem of systemic evil for atheists specifically, but I like them to read other chapters as well, because as you say, there are many other interesting alternatives to theism, and I argue that they also face the problem of evil. And as your banner says, the book is free. It's an open access title, even though it was published by Oxford University Press. So I would like everyone to download the book. You can download a whole PDF copy of the book.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
If you'd like a mini course on the problem of evil, where you'll be introduced to both the logical and evidential versions, skeptical theism, and various theodicies, then check out this playlist of videos with Dr. Daniel Speak right now.